People are going to have to say their name because I know you all, but Larry doesn't, so say your name.
Mohammed, candidate.
Okay.
So something, I forgot what my original question was, but around middle of the way through when you started mentioning the white working class, mentioning that we shouldn't just give up on them is understandable. Now, something that I've personally struggled with is looking at certain members of the white working class. So, for example, you guys, I generally mess with you guys are great, but some members, it's hard to consider them members of the working class, but rather as a member of the oppressing class, because a lot of them feed into the same fascist Nazi BS that we're currently fighting against. So how can we potentially unite them when at many, not even just their political beliefs, but many of their material actions show not just not being united with us, but being directly opposed to us, and more importantly, oppressing many indigenous, people of color, other members of the working class. It seems like it's I don't want to say it's an oxymoron because
It's a stretch.
That's a much better phrase.
It's a big stretch.
It's like if I walked up to Trump right now and was like, "Hey man, why don't you help us out? It'll help you too." It doesn't seem very logical sometimes.
Let's take one or two and then I'll respond. And others should respond to, a couple more questions. You got one?
Well, I guess like in the same vein as that, I have also heard like varying news reports, but that if you actually look at the average income of a Trump voter, that they, on average, don't actually make less money than the average other voter. So I'm also wondering about like how this term working class has lost its actual material significance, like who is working class and who can claim that. I guess it becomes another identity. So I'm curious what you think about that.
So I wanted to speak to Mohammed's question about, I guess on the level of logistically organizing a working class party, and that there's always going to be a section of the working class that is going to maintain reactionary and conservative ideas, right? And I think it was Mao that gave us a very simple organizing model called the mass line, where you're going to consolidate the advance, the politically advanced, you're going to convert the politically intermediate, and you're just going to isolate the politically backward. And once we've built up a legitimate party, once we've built up a legitimate party, and then they see where we've gone versus where they've gone, then if they want to come back over, then come on back over. I also want to address Hannah's. I don't want to answer all your questions.
No. It's a discussion.
Okay.
Go for it.
It is sort of a tempting thing to think of class as an identity, because eventually it does form who you are and how you interact with the world. But the Marxist conception of class maintains and still maintains a very material basis, right? And someone gave a very, very good description a long time ago, and I forget who it was. It was in like a place I wouldn't have expected to hear a really good class analysis. It was at like a drug conference, and it was like there's two kinds of people in the world: people who use their labor and work for their living, and there are people who their money works for them, right? So it's really, yes, there's always going to be different levels of the working class to the point where the line sort of gets fuzzy at the end. But at the end of the day, there are people who are just making money to pay their rent, and there's the people who exploit other people to make other people pay their rent.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering about is like how then, like if we have that real distinction, then how do we embrace parts of the white working class that are embracing Trumpism when they may, like, they become identified as working class even though they are I'm talking about my relatives who are appropriating other people's labor, literally. Like, so I'm just curious about how you do that.
Let me, this is a discussion, so people can chime in, and you don't, I'm glad you did that, because, you know, you don't have to just ask. You can also give your opinions on it. The people who voted for Trump probably fall in a number of categories, and some of them we should just write the fuck off. Yeah. I mean, and we should just have demonstrations against them, and, you know, arm ourselves and defend ourselves against them, because they're dangerous, especially if they have arms, you know. And these are the Klan types, and, you know, whatever, you know. There's a section of our class that may have tried out Trump out of desperation, and you have the Democratic Party to blame, because they have thrown this section of the working class under the bus with their neoliberal austerity, you know, everything for finance capitalism, nothing for the working class, you know. And so we lay a lot of blame at the capitalist Democratic Party for that. And a lot of people after the elections were speculating, you know, that, you know, if Bernie Sanders had, if the Democratic Party leadership had been wise enough, frankly, in retrospect, from their point of view, from their class point of view, not from a revolutionary point of view, to allow Bernie Sanders to get the nomination, he probably would be the president. And that would be different problems, but that would be different, you know, and actually that would have been a step forward in a way. It wouldn't be socialism, it would be a bourgeois project, but for many reasons it would be a step forward. Our problems would be different, our discussion would be different. But they didn't do that, you know. And a lot of the people who voted for Trump may have voted for Sanders, just based on, you know, he seems like he's against the system, you know, and to the extent that they sound similar, you know. I think now, in the struggle over the Affordable Care Act, and other struggles that are going to emerge on the local and national level, as it becomes clear that Trump has no real economic solution, and that he was selling a bag of hot air, you know, and that's basically what he is, you know, a bag of hot air. And as things get worse, there'll be economic struggles that we should take advantage of that will draw some in from that class. But I think it's important to make this distinction. One is about the identity of the working class and the tolerance level of the new working class. Trump and the media has tried to paint the working class as almost being completely reactionary white folks. It's a big lie. The fact of the matter, and I'm sure you've talked about it here, the working class has for a long, long time, you know, and you know, we're way beyond it now, is multinational, multi-gender, queer, trans, young. It's not based on whether you're in a union. It's not even based on whether you have a job. People who once thought they were middle class, people with all sorts of degrees have been forced into the working class. In some ways, this was one of the big material factors behind Occupy Wall Street. It was the youth who used to, you know, just once they got their BA and, you know, master's degrees, they went on and, you know, got a piece of the pie, you know, and joined the petty bourgeoisie and some of the bourgeoisie. Those doors were closed this time. They were only letting a few people in. And this year, they're letting even fewer and fewer. So those are social forces that are being forced into the working class. The working class is not static. It's not a white guy with a lunch pail and overalls going to an industrial job, a unionized industrial job. That's, you know, that's 50 years old, maybe longer, you know. It is everyone around us, even if they don't know it. The working class is changing. It's changing demographically. And, you know, when you go out there and you demonstrate for Black Lives Matter, and you go out there and you demonstrate in support of the queer community, that's a working class demonstration. When you go out there and demonstrate against no war on Syria, that's a working class demonstration. See, the problem in our movement, I think, is that some who call themselves socialists dismiss some of these issues as identity politics. And I think some of them even blame it for the election of Trump. You know, says that some of you were so concerned about, you know, black and brown people and the cops and, you know, whether trans people can go to the bathroom and say, and that you abandon the working class. We didn't abandon anybody. We are the working class. Right. You want to talk about who abandoned the working class? Hillary Clinton, the leadership of the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, and you know, it was a contradiction, but you know, our party recognized the historical significance of the first black president. But having said that, Obama is an imperialist. He's a neoliberal imperialist. You know, he made an ad for this joker, this banker who just won in France. You know, so blame them. They're the ones who went around during the election saying everything was okay. And we're not, you know, I think you were right about a lot of Trump's voters, you know, making more money than your average worker. I mean, some of it is about, some of it is some of these middle class people, white people, freaking out about losing the demographic race, you know, and also losing empire. That's going on too. They're freaking out, you know. We're in a process where the U.S. doesn't run the show on a global basis anymore, and white supremacy is under attack. And we shouldn't be surprised if they're having a seizure over that and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And it's ugly, and we shouldn't tolerate it, and we should protest it. But as dangerous as it is, it's also symptomatic of changes going on underneath. We should not tolerate racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ bigotry. We shouldn't tolerate it for a second. We should be in everybody's faces on this. And those sections of the working class who want to keep us tied to bigotry, if there's a chain, we should take that fucking chain and break it. You want to hold on to that? You hold on to that. Sorry, we're not making concessions. No, that boat has sailed. The new working class is here. We're younger, we're multinational, we're multi-gender, we're global, we think differently, you know, and we want to stay that way. And we're moving in a revolutionary direction. And don't confuse us with Obama. We're not the global elite, we're the global oppressed. Even though some people, for their own reason, try to mix us up, you know. We should not tolerate backwardness, you know. Our working class movement in many ways is more advanced. And I don't see how anyone can make an argument that it will be helpful to any section of the working class for us to back up on these issues. As a matter of fact, I think if we do that, our movement will break apart and lose its potential. What we must do, I think, as revolutionary socialists, is find ways of embracing people who don't even realize that they're part of the working class, who don't even know what social class they're in, who are just out there blowing in the wind with no job and no future, who feel actually socially, politically, and personally isolated, you know, who are in a constant financial, personal, and mental crisis because of capitalism today. Those kind of people must know that they have allies and comrades, and you are those allies and comrades. The working class has to be reconfigured. These old paradigms, you got to be in a union, you got to be a white man, you got to be this, you got to be that. Take all that stuff and, you know, shove it into some pile and call it history. We have to redefine our class. And we also have to redefine our organizations. Unions are very important. They are the frontline defense organizations of the working class. But we know by now that because of their leadership, they have limitations. So don't blame us if we form revolutionary organizations, if we build a workers' world party, if we build workers' defense committees, if we build organizations that have revolutionary ideas. Don't blame us for building not based on old ideas and traditions, but new revolutionary organizations that will help liberate the working class and all of its class and all of its sections.
And I think this kind of goes to what we're talking about. In your chapter in the book or whatever, you talked about the air traffic control strike.
Mm-hmm.
And that part really stuck with me because of this idea of like education through the struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And how you have these kind of like fairly upper middle class making like pretty good money, but and the strike was like a huge thing, and
it was big. It was enormous.
Reagan crushed it. But so if you could just like, in kind of everything we're talking about, these kind of bridges we have to build, like how we can do that through just kind of the struggle that we're naturally going to take on as like the work we're doing. So we just speak to that.
Okay, I've seen this formulation out there mostly in stuff from the 60s, and people influenced by the 60s are people who are oppressed on some sort of other category other than like race, nationality, or class. For example, like disabled people, queer people, etc. Can we think of that as an oppressed nation? Is that helpful, or is that muddying the category, and we should give these categories their own, separate mode of thought?
I think separating any oppressed group is not beneficial in any way. I mean, at the same time, again, all these oppressed groups have the same exact struggle against the same exact oppressors. Well, maybe not the same exact struggle, let me rephrase that, but against the same oppressors. I mean, generally, anybody who, like, when I go yell Black Lives Matter, I'm probably also yelling against somebody who's an Islamophobe, somebody who's a homophobe, somebody who's a transphobe, and as well as a bunch of other groups. To an extent.
But the question is, should we consider these people as nations?
Right.
Should we apply the framework of oppressed nations to like these oppressed groups within our own country? I would just clarify.
Yeah, well, my personal opinion, I'm trying to think about this and get other opinions, but where I'm coming from, I guess maybe more of the textbook definition. Nation is like a group of people who are like related, have a similar language, culture, maybe similar religion, and this group of people, don't have to be all in the same spot. There's plenty of nations that are desperate, like I'm Armenian, more Armenians live outside of Armenia than in the country, so, but that's almost different than, gay people kind of, depending on where they are, they might share some cultural traits that they might pick up, but like in that way, they're not all related, so it's kind of a bit away from the traditional definition of nation. I've seen that out there, to the point where I've even seen like gay separatist or whatever, and I think that's kind of more of a metaphor and more of a demand than like an actual thing that they're considering. We talked a little bit about New Africa in here. That would have been kind of more plausible than, I don't know, like every gay person moves to San Francisco and, it's its own.
Don't shoot me.
I just think that like all of these identities intersect. So like I could be a queer person, but then also a white person, and then like maybe I'm a woman right now, but maybe in the future I transition to be male. So like they all change, and I feel like one example of how, for example, queer politics is about disrupting the bourgeois family. And like the roles that women are put into to transmit capital from generation to generation. So I feel like they are all related. So even if they're not, queer politics is not necessarily nominally economic, but it's so much about the family structure that it becomes economic.
There's a reason there's so many trans queer communists like in the year 2017.
Right. No, I think y'all are figuring this out, and thank goodness. And I think that an older section of the left, unless they're paying attention to you, they're living in the past. Of course, there's a difference between national oppression and gender oppression. but they do intersect. They do intersect, and anybody who considers themselves anti-capitalist and pro-socialist, who is dismissive of gender struggles, I think is either confused or hypocritical. Because as you were saying, you know, what's the basis of the oppression of women and the oppression of queer people? It's patriarchy. What is patriarchy? It's a pillar of class society. Whose class society? Capitalism's class society. So how can you be anti-capitalist and not be struggling against a pillar of capitalism, the patriarchy? You know, you can write it off and say it's on some other sheet or something like that, but it is central to the struggle against capitalism. And I agree with what the comrade just said. It doesn't surprise us at all, and I don't think it should, that more trans and queer people are becoming revolutionaries, you know, because everything about this system, they're against it. This system literally tells them that you can't exist. You not only can't be recognized, you're not even supposed to exist. And so their right to existence is almost based on getting rid of the system. You know, so I mean, this is a ready-made audience, you know, in terms of becoming revolutionaries. It's another way our class is changing. And don't let other people who call themselves socialists, some may be well-meaning, some may do it out of ignorance, some may do it because of the generation they come from. Others, I won't be so generous with them. But don't let them identity bait, you know, or this is identity politics, this is not economics, this is not the class struggle at the industrial base, you know, and blah, 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 you know, this is something else. This is a movement. The biggest problem with the black movement, the anti-racist movement, the women's movement, the queer and trans movement is not the fact that organically these are working class struggles and also anti-capitalist struggles. The big problem is that because of the weakness of the revolutionary movement, of revolutionary organizations, it is petty bourgeois and bourgeois organizations that influence them. No wonder they don't see themselves as part of a class movement. Their leadership, or those who they take leadership from or some influence from, don't want them to look at it this way. They want them to feel separate or do it separately. This is something that we're struggling against. We'll find ways. You know, we've got a lot of ground to make up, but we'll find ways. And the new working class movement will do it. At some point, I mean, it seems so simple. And of course, every time we have a conference, it almost feels like, you know, like our conference last year in New York. But sometime soon, we have to have a party conference where we call it the new working class. And we celebrate those things about the new working class that have always been there, but have been suppressed in the past, have been kept quiet, like queer and trans people, like gender nonconformity. And then, of course, black and brown people and women and so forth. And all sorts of, this is a tremendous positive sign that people want to move forward into the future. They don't want to be stuck in all of the reactionary church bullshit of the past. And if my friends who call themselves socialists but get all bent out of shape about identity politics really had their head screwed on right, they would embrace this. They would see that this is the future and not being quiet to appease some ignorant person somewhere, some supposed ignorant person who gets turned off, you know, who's a worker, but don't say this, don't say that, don't raise this, don't raise that. You know, I'm not even sure there's that many people like that. And if they're there, you know what? maybe they're not going to be in the leadership of this struggle. You know what I'm saying? Maybe they'll have to be taking up the rear. Maybe we're not relying on them to pick up the banner and lead the revolution. Maybe they're going to, and that's just the way it is. It's always been this way down through history. It is the most oppressed who are the leaders because they have the least to lose.
So with that, I guess I'm thinking of some people who do take that sort of line of that this is identity politics, and they actually end up cannibalizing into the left and blaming the left for all the bad things. And I guess I'm kind of thinking, to some extent, it's not that they have a point, but we do need to, some level, be able to orient towards these backwards people to some degree. To not orient in like a, be able to speak to them in some ways. To, and to how should we do that? I'm probably not expressing this right because I agree with everything.
I think
how do you relate to these backwards people?
You've got a point, and we could probably talk about this for a long time because I think it's a big issue. I think it's a big issue, and a lot is written about it, a lot is said, and a lot of it's confusing and divisive. I still would argue that the nexus of the problem is that if you have the Democratic Party being the leader of the working class, supposedly, and it is a capitalist, neoliberal, austerity, attack the working class, take away everything we've won, bust unions, etc., 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 and they are the ones that are viewed as the champions in a phony baloney way of oppressed people. When you have that picture, I think that's one of the problems. The more it becomes clear that it is not Clinton and Obama who speak for the oppressed, the queer people, black people, brown people, Muslims. And they try to do, that's what they try to do.
Yeah.
That's their big thing. That's the only oxygen that they have in their tank because they don't have a solution out of the capitalist crisis. They don't have jobs. They don't even have a healthcare program. I mean, we could go and talk about how Obama set up what's happening, the attack on the Affordable Care Act. The more that our new working class movement clearly becomes a revolutionary movement with revolutionary anti-capitalist socialist leadership, I think the less that we'll have that problem. Of course, some of us have to be ready and able to, deal with certain sections of the working class where they're at. This is nothing new. We've been having to deal with this in relationship to racism, in relationship to sexism. It's just the beginning of time. It's nothing new. We have to find ways of speaking to every section of our class that we think is significant. But we have the right to write off some sections who may be technically in our class, but may not be helpful and may actually be reactionary and dead weight, who are holding everybody else down. And, excuse us. We have the right to take a sharp object and cut that shit off and say, you are on your own. You want to stay in a reactionary swamp where you're a bigot and this is important to you, and you're not evolving. Well, okay, good. Guess what? We're leaving you, And we're not going to build a movement on another basis. We won't build it. You all will rebel, and rightfully so.
I think that point you made is so important because I remember one of the classes where I go to school, there was some big deal Democrat in there. She's the chief of staff of the Maryland Speaker of the House, and she was talking about how the Democratic Party needs to be a tent. And I was like, okay, so you're telling me we got to accept every bigoted jackass schmo, homophobic, transphobic, racist, whatever. And he goes, oh, that's what makes us so great or whatever. No, it's fucking, what are you talking about? So like the idea that, we do want to be inclusive, we do want to have a broad definition of working class, but there's got to be a point where it's like, get off the, shit off the pot, like, for Christ's sake, like, it's time to, I just really appreciate
comrades, be militant and forward marching and forward acting. You are becoming the leadership of the working class. The working class, not the working class of 1951 or 1930 something or even 1970. The working class of the 21st century. And more our movement has to realize that no, you're not lost. You're not out there flopping in the wind with no social identity and just a victim, in this capitalist nightmare that is burning down around us. You are the working class. You don't have to have a job because there aren't many. Sometimes you got 3 part-time jobs. You don't even have to have an apartment. Being in the working class is not based on some say stability. Who the fuck has stability? Really. There may be a handful of us, who are receiving Social Security. I don't know who has stability. There's no such thing as stability unless you are really, got a lot of money, some sources of income. We are all becoming more and more, some of us more equally unstable because this is capitalism in 2017. Supporting each other. I think that's why supporting each other and understanding each other and bonding with each other and deepening your understanding of all these issues, gender issues and the way they're being raised, that's absolutely essential. I've been waiting for this time. I've been waiting for the cultural revolution in the working class movement. The working class movement has needed a cultural revolution. It's been led by straight men. Even the black liberation movement to a large extent, which is not forgetting that there's some, tremendous, brave, black revolutionary women who have martyred themselves, who are exiled, like, our sister in Cuba, whatever. But what I've seen in the Black Lives Matter movement has been a cultural revolution, where finally women and queer people have said, I'm not staying back here anymore. I'm not staying quiet. And I'm not arguing with you. Get out of my way. The argument is over. Get out of my way. I will kick your ass, and I will get some people to help me, and it's what they had to do. At the end of the day, to me, this makes me cry in joy, tears of joy, because this had to happen. This had to happen. And again, don't, what you were saying was so righteous. Don't let a section of the bourgeoisie try to pass itself off as the champion of the oppressed. It's a fraud.
Right.
It's a fraud. It's a fraud to sell neoliberalism.
Yeah, I had a question of, like, how do you envision reparations and how do you define that?
Well, our party's for reparations, and we've written about it, and we support most everybody who fights for it. But your questions sound like a very practical one. And there'll be a time when we have power, Well, no. Even before we have power, we will be dealing with reparations, And actually, while I have no, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what the future of that struggle is, the immediate future of it is. There are dynamics, in the capitalist crisis that actually may push the struggle for reparations to the front again. It's hard to say. So, you know, if that happens, and it'll be a dividing line, because there are many people who consider themselves socialists, and certainly people who consider themselves progressive, who do not support reparations. One of them is Bernie Sanders, and this was one distinction that we made early on, you know. But as our movement gets bigger and is more representative, genuinely more representative of all the sections of our class, which are the workers and the oppressed, and what capitalism has done, and this is different than the way the world looked 100 years ago, certainly 150 years ago. There are workers and there are the oppressed, and there's still a pretty big fundamental distinction. But that distinction is a complex one, and is constantly evolving. As capitalism levels the living standards of everyone, and as capitalism shrinks the planet on so many levels, new technology, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you know, we'll have coalitions and alliances that will be representative of larger and larger sections of our class on a global basis. And people will bring to the table what their demands are. And reparations will be one of them. And it won't just be descendants, you know, of slaves here. It will be Africa. I mean, look what imperialism has done to Africa. It'll be our Arab, you know, comrades. It'll be Asia. You know, they'll be coming to the table, you know. Imperialism has been ripping them off for centuries. And we'll welcome them. We will welcome them. Native people, you know, there will be a place for them at the table. You know, and the thing that we know is that when we do have power, there is no injustice that we cannot reverse. That is the wealth that exists on the earth. That is the wealth that exists on the earth. There is no injustice that cannot be reversed.
Well, I remember reading a kind of a debate, I don't know when it must have taken place, sometime in the 20th century, around like reparations and like socialist construction in the imperialist powers post-revolution. And I remember like kind of a distinction of two different schools of thought, that either we would raise the productive forces to such a degree that living standards would stay the same or increase in the imperialist countries, as well as provide you know, a leveling force to the you know, oppressed nations. And then the other side said that what would have to happen is that the first world, you know, the imperialist powers, living standards would have to decrease from what they are in order to do that. And I guess, what do you think on that?
Another question. Or
Oh, go ahead, Anna.
Well, I guess similar to that is one of the criticisms I've read of Marxism is that they still view nature as like something to exploit for means of production, and not like humans living in synchronicity with nature. So I'm wondering what you think about that relationship.
I was just gonna respond. It's funny that you mentioned that, because our comrade at the climate march had like a sign. I can't remember exactly what it said, but it was actually talking about like how we wouldn't, if we love this, we would not use it for another means of, you know, production. I can't remember.
Aaron's sign.
Yeah, Aaron's sign. I can't
Aaron's
remember
sign.
exactly.
Oh,
what it
Aaron's
said.
sign.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are ways.
I hate to pile on to a big pile, but it's related. So I've heard calls from Native American activists to, you know, almost expel everybody who's not Native American, or leave it, do a referendum for what for the Native American, you know, nation to decide whether or not to expel everyone else. So, you know, that's and people take it seriously. It's like some of the people who've been to Standing Rocks take this proposal seriously. So I want to, you know, see. That almost seems like an after the revolution kind of, you know, leveling kind of deal.
well, you know, the technological. You understand?
No, you go first.
The technological level of the productive forces of society, I mean, has never been greater in human history. It's unimaginable. It's almost, it's indescribable. It's so tremendous. And it's hard to imagine a circumstance where any distribution of wealth on a global basis would result in a reduction of the living standard for a sizable section of the population. You know, the rich may suffer, you know, and you know, how many billions of people are there on the planet? Yeah, I mean, maybe that's a, you know, maybe that's a few hundred million. I don't know. I'm not sure. You know, but that's very small. You know, the technological level is so great. The ability not only to meet the basic needs, but the wants and desires of people, and to free them from labor, you know, so they have leisure and live longer and can explore art and music and human relations and space and whatever else they want to do, and develop as living things and save the planet and have time to, you know, to plant gardens, you know, and take care, and you know, communities being built on the basis of mutual support. You know, even an imperfect revolutionary planet would be imaginably greater than what we have. You know, capitalism is the door that's blocking all that up. And as for oppressed people having radical demands, you know, it won't be the first time, and it's understandable. But I don't think we should doubt the ability, if people are genuinely coming to the table to discuss injustice, both presently and historically, and are of good, you know, of goodwill and good faith. I don't think that we. Who says it's going to be? Who says it's going to be easy? Who says there aren't going to be arguments? Who says there aren't going to be differences? Who says it isn't going to take a while? You know, and some people may walk away from the table, and then you know, you have to send a delegation out to bring them back. You know, but it's almost a part of the world being reborn. And that's going to be, you know, birth is a traumatic process, you know, and we should look forward to that, you know, and there may be. This is hypothetical. I'm thinking about what you said about, you know, Native people, you know, wanting people to just leave. You've been, you know, you came and occupied my land. Get the hell out of here, you know. That's one section of indigenous people. You know, there are indigenous people whose lands have been stolen from them and who have suffered genocide all over the planet. You know, so just the whole question of what does justice mean for indigenous people is going to be an enormous question. And in some cases, the rest of us, the rest of the world, the non-indigenous world, I mean, you know, I don't know if that's a good formulation, may have to make some concessions. Guess what? We may have to make some radical concessions. There'll be enough for everyone. There'll be enough around for everyone. And the most important thing, I mean, as if there isn't enough, we're bombarded by, you know, by surplus products. You know, they drive us crazy. You have hundreds of, you know, brands of the same thing that you can't afford. You know, this is a form of oppression. I think it is. It's a form of oppression. When we get rid of capitalism, it'll be the beginning of humans meeting each other and their relationships not being toxic and not being poisoned by class society and all this material shit that some of us think they throw at us, so that we'll forget just how bad everything is and how alienated we are from each other, and that we don't give a damn about the very planet that sustains us. You know? Just getting to know each other, getting to love each other, getting to like each other, realizing that we're all kind of one in one way and not against each other, you know, will be a lot better than having 300 brands of the same damn thing. But I guess to make that comparison, you sort of have to make a human step. You have to make a human social step forward. You know, please help us make that step forward, comrades. If I'm not there, please help me. Please help us make that. It's up to you. I don't want you to feel a burden, but yes.
I don't want you to feel the weight of the world on your shoulders.
Yeah, exactly.
Not literally.
Yeah.
Just gotta save the world.
Go ahead.
Oh, just this goes back to John's question. I said something about what Hannah said too, on the question of reparations. Mainly because Andre's back there very quiet, but he spearheaded a group called Labor for Reparations and fought in the labor movement for reparations. I just thought I'd add that. I wanted to say something real briefly about Bernie Sanders, and it has to do with the question that we're talking about, especially around reparations. I mean, you know, he refused to take a stand on this critical issue. And I think it's not so much, I think it's a very practical question and a big problem that he didn't. Not because, you know, he could have changed things this way or that way. It's that he could have had an influence on all the young white followers that he had. And that's, I think, what was most important. If he would have taken that stand, it would have raised the issue of reparations and it been more of a thoroughgoing question of discussing racism in a more deeper sense. So if he had done that, I think it would have really pushed the struggle forward a lot. And I don't think it's an abstract question. Just recently, and I know Hannah was involved in this and others in Rasica, the climate change demonstration. It had a big problem, I think, and people haven't been talking about it. I mean, there's lots and lots of big problems about it, but one of the problems that I thought it had was the timing of the demonstration. It was on the 29th, and the Earth Day was the 22nd. And why I say that was a big major problem is that I think that objectively it took away from May Day, which, you know, as Comrade Larry was talking about earlier, May Day was like, is the day for the immigrant community to come out. And also the revolutionary and socialist community come out. And I think it was some of the Democratic Party leadership underneath all of the climate change folks who pushed it to the 29th, because years ago, not that many years ago, the 22nd was the date that they always did this on Earth Day. So I don't think the questions are so abstract to the movement right now in applying, okay, national question is a weird terminology or whatever, it seems archaic. And I think it's harder now it was different in the 60s because the liberation movements in other countries like Vietnam and around the world were taking place. So our generation kind of, I think, understood some of that better. Now the millennials, it's like a different ballgame because so much has been wiped out.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, I think what Larry was describing in his talk was more current, is that whole change in the working classes taking place, which we got a book for. I did want to end with one thing on what Hannah said about Marx. It is true, and I think what people have to understand is the verbiage of a lot of Marxism and what Marx wrote years and years ago, decades and decades and decades ago, talked in different language than what we might talk today. I mean, Marxism is a science, and I think it's erroneous to pin a name or what do you call it onto a science of understanding the world. And so there is a segment, I know what you're talking about, that they will quote about conquering nature. I think that's the segment. There's worse segments, frankly, if you want to be honest. I mean, during that period of time, they didn't have an understanding of, you know, a deeper understanding of colonialism and the, you know, I could come up with some other worse stuff. I mean, you have to always take things in context, even like when we talk about this a lot even here locally, like this is incredibly revolutionary letter. But then somebody will look at it and say, it says the Negro upsurge, and what the hell does that mean? We wouldn't even think of utilizing this terminology now, which during the time that Sam was writing was the politically preferred terminology. Like now we'd say black or African American. So, history changes things and how we look at things. But not so much because people were better than people are then, it's because material conditions have changed so much. Even with women's and, LGBTQ and trans liberation, things have changed drastically even from the 60s. So, language changes, how people view things changes, and the working class has changed. But, I think they're being a little disingenuous, to pull out, not because I feel defensive about Marx as a person, heck no. There's lots of stuff, I don't even want to tell you about it, or stuff. But, the reality is, okay, David, you help me out. Like, for instance, we used to say primitive communism was a terminology that was utilized. And now it's
They
called
say primary communism.
primary communism. Just because words, understandings, and how do you
Sounds
say?
pejorative.
Yeah,
Now it doesn't, yeah, right.
but during that time it meant something different scientifically, and it still means the same thing scientifically. But our understanding of words is advancing and is better, so we improve things.
I have another. Do you want to go first?
Oh, yeah, sure. Also to address the natural resources question, because it is really important, because I think at the base of the question is like, yes, as long as commodities need to be produced, as long as things that we need to live need to be produced, we're going to view the natural world as a resource, right? But when there's careful planning, and when there's only needing to produce as much as is necessary, there's not going to be the sort of ravaging of the natural
Right,
world that there
because
is
things
under
commodity
capitalism.
production.
And eventually, the commodities that are needed as technology develops, with central planning, we can plan to wean off our use of natural resources, or at least be able to replace what we take and sort of live alongside nature and natural resources, as opposed to the way that we view it now as like, let's just settle this big forest, chop it entirely down, and that makes us a huge profit. And there's going to be just lumber sitting on shelves. You know what I mean? It's going to be addressed in a much different way than it is under capitalism.
Can I just go off that for a second?
Okay,
so that just made me really think. I have a lot of friends who are like environmentalists, very typical liberal environmentalists, and and again I hear this same argument that whatever, it's still going to be based on the exploitation of the environment. But it's kind of what you were saying about technology, like. To me, I've always kind of thought about it, environmental consciousness is going to be inherent, I think, in socialism. I really do believe that, like, we're going to have a smarter way of viewing things. It's not going to be based off exploitation for profit. And we're going to use some of the technologies that capitalism advanced, we're going to use those in a way where, like, we're going to be able to take care of the environment. It's going to come naturally.
It would be an absolute necessity.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
It would be suicidal to do otherwise.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear the environmental concerns come up. My name is Ty. I volunteer with the Baltimore Green Party for about the past year now. And one exciting topic that I've come across is a resource-based economy. I'm sure some of you have heard of, I think his name is Jacques Fresco, guy in Florida. I think he's an engineer. He's got all sorts of credentials, and he calls himself a futurist. And so his approach to preserving the environment, first, I think it's predicated on the idea that growth in and of itself is not inherently good, and in fact it's a crash course we have a limited number
It's
of
like
resources.
cancer.
Yeah, that's what the cancer, it just grows
Right.
for the sake of growing, until you're consuming everything around
Right.
you. So the idea, I think, of a resource-based economy meshes well with the planning that you're talking about. So I just want to share that.
When I was younger and I was in college, I remember watching a lot of Jacques Fresco's videos. It's interesting, but the thing I realized where I from really being into this guy towards being more a Marxist was that he's what was called a utopian, and he doesn't have a plan on how to get there other than to convince people this is a good idea. But that doesn't work. You can't convince people with anything. Especially not when you need to do things just because you think it's a good idea. It's got to come organically from the movement. At least that's the way I fell out of favor with him. But I like what he gets people thinking about is the same stuff. He's got these beautiful drawings of these ring cities and stuff where you have your fields on the outside and all. It's really cool.
Well, I think it can be built.
Right.
That's the
It can
thing.
be
That's-
done.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And it doesn't need to happen incrementally. And I think we just got to rethink our institutions, where do we want to get our energy from? Where do we want to get our water from? What kind of transactions is it going to take to make that happen?
What kind of just say capitalism is incapable of even thinking for a year and a half. Right. They think in quarters.
Right.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Right.
Quarter to quarter from the bank statement.
And that's being generous. It's there's no greater contradiction that one can imagine. The level of technology and the complete recklessness and anarchy of investment production, over this overgrowth, over that, it's I don't want to use the word insane because we may be insane, but if we are, it's because of capitalism, But there's just no greater. It's like a wild animal is, grab the world and its future and is galloping away, and until we get that animal and put it down, we're in a lot of trouble.
Don't let the environmentalists hear you.
Some of the some of what comrades are saying too makes me think of this. The sociological changes. Very few people have come to terms with them. I mean, people are writing about them. I would speculate that you comrades know more. There's so much available online. A section of the world population, not all of it, not nearly all of it, a section is far more educated than they've ever been, and that's a global phenomenon. They think that they know a lot. They have expertise. What I'm getting is that as we move forward in terms of what direction the world is going in and the class struggle, you're going to have a lot of social forces putting forth a lot of ideas. Some of them with a lot of good information and a lot of good analysis, and there's a little bit of this, there'll be more of it. That is, instead of waiting to overthrow capitalism, trying to develop new societies sort of below or aside, and sort of occupying space, next to capitalism. And there are many who think that that's the way, that basically you'll do that, and at some point capitalism will die because the spaces around it will be, occupied by anti-capitalist projects, that humans living together on another basis. It's a very nice idea, and no doubt there'll be some of that. And it'll be all the more so the next huge economic crisis, and that's inevitable. When people who are really doing bad will be utterly poor, and we will be, planting stuff to survive. And more of us will be living with each other because there'll be no other place to go. Because this is what happens. And it's a global, the trauma and the suffering is a global phenomenon. But we should not, let's not be too tempted by this nice idea that we can outlive capitalism by just growing communal societies, everywhere, We've got to, capitalism is not going to go out without a fight, just like slavery.
Right.
It's not going to go out without a fight. You're going to have to fight it. You can't just outlive it. You can't just, side by side. That's all very interesting. I'm sure a lot of that's going to happen. Some of it may happen on the basis of survival, frankly. It already is. But sooner or later, there's got to be clashes, bigger clashes, and bigger clashes, and bigger clashes, and final and decisive clashes with the capitalist system. And so none of this stuff negates the class struggle, the global class struggle. I mean, there may be new ways. The technological and social changes, it changes everything. It's something important to remember about Marxism. Some of us Marxists sometimes even get tired of referring to Marx because it should be science. It's the name of an individual. That's the way it is. But it's a social science. And it's not static. It's not stagnant. Any science that is stagnant is no longer a science. It becomes a dogma or a religion or something else. Science is dynamic. Things that change other things. That is the dialectics of things. That's the chemistry. That's the physiology of things. Everything is changing, and as everything changes, it changes everything else. Behavior, society, the way we think, the way we, even think. It changes it in ways that we can see, and it changes it in ways that we can't see. So, the smartest Marxists realize that, which means that they're not living in the past, and they're not dug in on different paradigms. The struggle looked this way 100 years ago. But does that mean it's going to look that way 10 years from now or 5 years from now? Society is different. It's organized different. Its relationship to each other is different. It's not based in factories. There's all sorts of things that distinguish how people are organized and how they relate to each other today compared to even a short while ago. All of these things ultimately play a factor in the struggle, how the struggle unfolds. They ultimately play a role in politics and in all social questions. And anyone who is looking at the past for the way to go to the future, there may be some basic things that are there. And we Marxists will be the first ones to say that. But in a lot of other ways, all of the superstructural things, don't be confused. The world's changing. Everything's changing. Actually, read the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. I mean, anybody who thinks that communist theory is static, Marx blows it away. Just read that first chapter. Because it's about how everything is constantly changing. And then changes again. It's about the instability and the constant deepening crisis of capitalism. But everything affects everything, and it's constantly changing. And then it changes again, and it destroys more, and it takes in toll more people until it's undone. So anyway.
Gina, you had your hand up. You haven't spoken before.
I don't know if it's a very good question or not. I don't know if I'm wording it well either.
There's
Don't worry
no
about it.
good or bad questions in this place.
We'll figure that out.
The only bad question is when you don't ask.
Okay, so I guess one thing that I've thought about, and something that I've seen recently, and I think that is important and should be addressed kind of moving forward, and it's more practical based, I guess, is a lot of people in our class in rural communities, because I went to school in a rural community, like high school, and I grew up there. And, of course, there are very bigoted people. There are, the stereotypical angry white redneck farmers who are just really bad people, and of course, blocked by. Don't need that. But I see the people of my generation who, some of them are kind of indoctrinated by the beliefs from their parents, and that's kind of passed down. And I think that's something that should be addressed. But what I also see is people and people that I speak with on the internet, especially in different parts of the country, who are mostly queer and trans people who are stuck. And they don't have the resources, they don't have the money to get out and go to somewhere where maybe there is a branch or in the city. Because when you're in the city, you could walk a couple blocks and reach so many more people than if you're in a rural community. And I think that we can't just ignore them, and we have to go and kind of, you know, liberate these people and say, we are coming to you, we are coming to where you are because that's what you need. We need to stand up for you as well, for people in agriculture, for people who are, you know, queer, trans, disabled, for black and brown youth, and people who, you know, just can't get to the city. So I guess, you know, how do we do that, I guess is kind of where I'm going. But yeah, you know, practical question, like how do we do that? How do we reach out to these people? I mean, certainly through the internet is huge, and that's very helpful, but are there more things that we can do, and how do we build these movements in these communities that are very hostile to people in our class who would agree with our ideas?
So that's actually a good segue into like what I wanted to talk about a little bit, which really stemmed off of something you said earlier about Trumpism, fascism, even liberal bourgeois democracy being an attack on the working class, right? And I think because we did, some comrades and I did some pretty serious study about how fascism operates, what the class character of fascism operates, and it is the bourgeois, the big bourgeois, sicking the petty bourgeois onto the working class, right? And I think when people hear attacking the working class, that we don't necessarily understand like what that means concretely, and it's a very real thing that happens viciously under fascism, but also just gradually under bourgeois democracy. It's an atomization and a decentralization of the working class. And what I mean by that is,
Good words, yeah.
it is working class organizations and just gatherings of working class people become smaller and smaller and more spread out. And as people get pushed out of cities and into more rural areas, it's exactly what's happening, right? And it's not just where people are living; it's smaller and smaller workplaces, right? And it's just something that under fascism, like, gets instituted as smaller workplaces, or if you can't decrease the size of the workplaces, you institute things like work speed-ups. So people can never ever talk to each other, never ever organize. And you'll notice that the places where there are still bigger workplaces, grocery stores, public sector workplaces, there's places where there are still relatively higher amounts of unionization, right? So it's really, so I just want to sort of lay that out and make that concrete for people. What that attack on the working class looks like is, at the same time that people are not being allowed into upper classes and being pushed into a working class, they're also just being crushed as a class and feeding the unemployed labor army, making people more and more desperate to be paid any amount of money, willing to take on 3 or 4 gigs at a time just to pay the rent. And we all see this happening more and more. And it's really, I mean, like I said, I didn't have a question, but it's like I wanted to lay that out and really just talk about it being our responsibility to not just push back against that, but also be organizing wherever we can, so that organized communities can exist despite there being an active attack against them.
It's feeding into, you know, the defining and redefining the precariousness of the working class. It's a good point. I had something else I wanted to say, but more people want to chime in.
But I think specifically Gina's question is like an American question, and by America I don't mean the USA, I mean the Americas, because like if you look at just like the way in which this country was developed, it's very like it's a different landscape of production than in like the old world, where like there was a limited amount of space that was filled up, and then things were built on top of it and on top of it and on top of it in the same places for thousands of years. I don't want to erase the indigenous history of the Americas, because there is like a rich and ancient indigenous history, and we still see its monuments today. But like the way in which the Americas and the USA were developed, I think leads to these very isolated rural communities that you're talking about. It's not to say there isn't isolation in, say, like Siberia, you know, in like rural areas in the rest of the world. But like there's something very, very, to talk about like the US farm community and the US small town and like the cult of the US small town. It's a very specific, like, I think we can talk about like that. It's a very specifically American sort of issue. But I mean, I certainly, like, I've been in the struggle for fucking, like, 7 months, so, you know, I'm not saying I have answers to, like, how to organize rural communities, but I feel like the answer, like, the first answer is the most, like, common sense one, is just, like, fucking go there. And that takes money.
Yeah.
You know, that takes money, resources, time, you know, not having a job and still being able to sustain yourself. We can't do any of those things, right? Not really, not realistically. But like, I don't know, I can't, right now I'm having a hard time imagining how to really build class consciousness and solidarity in these like isolated rural areas that are culturally isolated, physically isolated and culturally isolated. So, yeah, but I think that, I mean, that said, like, you know, the Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, these places are a couple hours away. But these places are a couple hours away from us. You know, comrades in Wisconsin organized across a distance of 4 hours. You know, comrades like in the Midwest organized across huge distances in these isolated areas for this like specific, like, and like work, and they're, you know, it's not like, it doesn't happen overnight, but it is possible. So, yeah, just to speak more to Gina's question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, David, I'll go after you.
Audrey had a hand.
I've been.
Oh, Andre.
Audrey.
Audrey.
This is gonna happen every time.
I guess I don't really have an answer either. I just wanted to say some solidarity because I'm from the boonies too. And I just like, I think about this all day and all night because I have a group of queer friends back home. We all got kicked out of our houses. We're all just trying to struggle to like make rent and everything without the help of anybody. And I guess we do have to go back, you know, and I'm really scared about that, you know, because that's where all of, I'm like, I literally have like, it's scary. Like I have to be away from like the towns that I grew up with, but I think we do. I just like, especially like moving here where it's a majority black city, like I don't want to, I can't speak for anybody's issues here, so maybe we gotta go back.
Good, sir.
Just on the question and stuff though, that's the reason why we gotta grow stronger and we gotta get bigger, frankly. So that we do have the resources and we do have the people to do that. Now, we have done some of it, strangely enough. We went to Berlin. You remember Berlin? You weren't there, but at the time, Rosika, myself, and David were there, and that was a trip. We were fighting Trump out in Berlin, Maryland, and stuff, and it was an amazing experience, and we met people. And when we were out Devon prison, we met people. And it's amazing that there are pockets of resistance in these areas. But I think the answer right now, Audrey, is stay in Baltimore till we can grow stronger, and so we can send more than just one person who's isolated back to wherever the boonies. A lot of people are from the boonies, like maybe all of us, half of us at least. The other part about it is people should know there's a growing movement amongst the immigrants called Cosecha, and that group in particular is doing a lot of work in the fields, and they have a new philosophy from some of the movement in terms of being against the policy-oriented stuff during the Obama administration. They have a more radical approach to the issue, and they're demanding permanent residency. So there's stuff that's happening out there, and there are people that are struggling. And I made that kind of thing because, in case I don't get to say it at the end, I'm passing around a sheet of paper at the same time. If people would want to be part of a Facebook group, because we have not answered a lot of questions. There's just constant discussion. We can have a private Facebook group, or if people would prefer a Google group, I know some of our comrades in Durham, North Carolina use a Google group to go back and forth and discuss things. That's fine too. Any way that we can utilize to basically talk to each other would be good. But I just wanted to raise that. Don't leave us yet, Audrey. There's lots and lots of things that you can do to support the struggle of the oppressed right in Baltimore. And for those of us who marched during the Freddie Gray thing, which Comrade Larry was with us, you remember those long treks across this thing, the community very much was very happy and encouraged to see young white folks out in that march. That was important, so that the black youth in Baltimore are not isolated, from the rest of the world. So that was important. I don't want to go into a long thing on that, but really, truly stay here for a while. And then we go back with you. I'll drive back with you.
I've been reading this book, and all the people I talk to a lot, I've heard this 1,000 times, but it's this incredible book that's really old, actually, called Hammer and Hoe. About
it's a great book.
Yeah, and it's about the Communist Party during the 1930s in Alabama, mostly Birmingham, which is like, one of the most like repressive, terrible places as far as like Jim Crow, segregation, and all this. And it talks about like all their struggles, the industrial stuff, but why I'm thinking of it is because all the stuff around like the Sharecroppers Union, and it was all about like these rural black folks and how they like resisted the Klan, even the less organized vigilante justice, not justice, vigilante, yeah, I guess that's a term anyway, but the vigilante people, how they like found ways to resist by like dropping off like leaflets and distributing things kind of in secret and over large distances, and somehow in some ways used the ruralness to their advantage. That's really cool. If you ever get the chance, read that book, because it's like the most incredible like history that nobody knows about. Mm-hmm. Like all these, like the amount of violence they faced is like you know it, but you don't really know it until you read it, and it's like, oh, they had a rally and everything went fine, but that night the organizer's house was burned down, and it's like that was just like there's like tons of stories like that in that book. I had a question for Larry. And this is like probably really basic, and but I guess like when we talk about the workers and the oppressed unite. When Lenin put that into like the formation, they meant like a very specific thing by the oppressed back then. At least I think they did. When they meant oppressed nations, oppressed, the colonial people. When we talk about the working class now being so, multi, it's different nationalities, immigration status, gender, sexuality. What is when we say the workers and the oppressed, when the oppressed are workers, what do we, I don't want to negate that, but also what does it mean to make them sound separate by saying the workers and the oppressed when the oppressed are also the workers? And they're not peasants or whatever, a different social class than used to exist.
It's a good question, and like I was saying before, Marxism is a dynamic thing. You use it, to try to analyze and respond to new things, not just what somebody said before. The world was different when the movement raised workers and oppressed nations unite. Now the world is more integrated. A lot of it is agricultural, but it's somewhat less. It's different on so many levels. But yet, there still is marked differences in the social status of people, based on who they are, based on the color of their skin, based on their gender, and other things, based on being disabled. I go by what Marx said in something he wrote, I think it was in the 1860s. it may have been in relationship to the formation of the First International. He wrote something called The Three Phases of Trade Unionism. You know, and you know, the basic one, okay, the workers get together, they fight with the boss, you know, to find a better share of, you know, the surplus value that they're creating. But that's just the beginning, and that's the working class the way it is. Now, I'm extrapolating from it. I'm not using his words. The working class is very different now. And what Marx laid out was that at a certain point, because of the development of capitalism, it won't be enough just to be trying to negotiate and fight for a better share of the surplus value you created. You'll be tasked with uniting larger and larger sections of the working class. In particular, those sections of the working class that are marginalized. You know, use whatever term you like, more oppressed, poorer, less social status, less political status, whatever. I like oppressed because it's a good catch-all. You know, some are all workers are under capitalism, and some are worse off. You know, so you talk about migrant workers, but then you talk about queer workers, whose situation is different, who face certain things that other workers don't face. And it's something that makes them less equal, less privileged. And then you talk about racism, and you talk about sexism, and you talk about any number of things. And then there's geographical differences, and industrial differences, and unionized and non-unionized. So, from a Marxist perspective, here's the problem. Simplifying the working class and making it look and feel like this, like a white guy with overalls going to an industrial job, is the problem. Seeing the working class as being colorful and multi-layered on every possible issue, gender, race, you know, that's not slicing things up and making things more confusing. Actually, that's seeing a clearer picture. And here's the thing. If you don't lift up, if you don't reach out consciously, I'm talking about us as revolutionary leaders, trying to be the best revolutionary leaders we can. If you don't reach out, identify, embrace, and lift up each section of that class, then, especially during this phase of capitalism, you know, self-destructing on us all. And what does it do? What does that do to us? We all tend to turn inward. We all tend to turn to the groups that we feel closest to. This is a big problem for the class struggle. This is one of the reasons that Trump prevailed, and could be one of the reasons for any number of political developments that are similar or maybe not so similar to Trump. People turn inward. They turn inward. Yet, we want to try to maximize unity. How do you maximize unity? Someone might say, perhaps understandably, well, don't get into all the things that make us different. Maybe that's the best way. Just, you know, forget about all that stuff, you know. But maybe that's not the solution. Maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe everybody who's marginalized, by virtue of the fact that they are marginalized, have historically been marginalized, and something new is happening. Economic and political changes are pushing them like fists through concrete. And they're at a point where, no, we don't want to be generalized over. We want to be recognized, number one. We want to be embraced. And we have some issues that we want society to address. I think the Marxist way of dealing with that global phenomena is try your best to unite everybody by embracing everybody, not by not seeing them. And so, as you know, you can look at it this way. This is a terrible, sweeping generalization. Maybe it does violence in some ways, but you know, I'll risk it. Where we identified workers by industry. Now that was important. It used to be very important. You know, there's auto workers, there's service workers. For some socialists, service workers weren't so important. Weren't they wrong? You know, well, you gotta make something. You gotta be at the means of production, you know, whatever, or else you're not in the proletariat, you know. People used to say this stuff. They used to think like this, you know, where there used to be industry, there used to be geography. Those things were important distinctions. Nationality, maybe. Those were embraced. Everybody who was an organizer knew it. Why can't this flowering of other distinctions, to some extent, replace older distinctions that in many ways are not as relevant because of the evolution of the capitalist economy? They're not as relevant. They're still relevant, but they're not as relevant as they were. Why? I think this comrade said it, or maybe several comrades said it. Because in this phase of capitalism, we work in smaller workplaces. We're more atomized.
Right.
You know, our unity comes less from circumstances than it does from political goals. Common political goals, global political goals. But you can't simplify that. You can't generalize that. You have to address every significant sector, you know, especially and particularly if you recognize that it's not just saying, oh, I've got this wonderful identity, you know, I smoke a pipe, you know. No. I suffer an extra degree of oppression because of what I am. Because of what I am. You know, these are different identities that make up the working class. I firmly believe they have to be recognized and they have to be embraced. We will be together on some issues that we all share in common. But we will more and more have to be together on issues that some of us are in solidarity with others. Some of us who don't share a circumstance or an oppression are in concrete solidarity. And we're not in that solidarity out of political correctness or some guilty conscience or something like that. You know, we're in it because this is how we strengthen our class. This is the road to victory. You know, right. That's it. That's how you unite the workers and the oppressed. We should keep talking about this and keep redefining it and perfecting our view. And I doubt whether our view will be a perfect one for a long time because things are changing too rapidly. And if we're not talking about it, somebody else is talking about it. You know, I was thinking of, you know, the comrade who raised the queer people who are isolated in rural areas. You know, the reason why we have to find a way to embrace those people is because if revolutionaries don't do it, less than revolutionaries will do it. They'll find, and it'll be, there's a political factor here. There's a consequence. If we don't do it, somebody else will do it. Whether it's the fascists, whether it's the Democrats, whether it's some religious, you know, somebody with an agenda that's not a revolutionary agenda will do it. That's why even if we mess up and we have to go back to the drawing board, you know, our class is different, it's organized differently. Just attitude's important. I come back to that. Remembering how capitalism, until we have a certain, a certain level of unity in terms of the relationship of class forces, the capitalist crisis has the opposite effect. It disunites and divides people. It actually has us fighting for fewer and fewer crumbs. And people become more desperate and more violent over it. And it's a real global crisis. And we see it here in this country, and I'm not sure we've seen the worst of it. It's a cannibalistic thing. It's our class pointing at each other. It's another reason for us to struggle to be in the name of unity again, not for some kind of weird, guilty, and I have to do everything perfectly, and I should feel bad because I'm white or something like that. I'm not into that, and I don't. That's a dead end, Here's Marxism. In the long run, no one does anything that's not in their class interest. And if you ask somebody to do something that's not in their class interest, you might as well ask them to swallow poison. They won't do it as soon as they recognize it's poison. That said, being sensitive to the most oppressed is important. Sometimes the most oppressed are angry. Sometimes people don't want to deal with that anger. They don't want to hear it. Sometimes they take it personally. Is the anger directed toward me? Please, I'm not guilty with somebody else who did it. I'm with you. I think you all know what I'm talking about. Who would want that? Who would want that on anybody? But sometimes you got to hear it. If you want the oppressed in the door, sometimes you got to hear their anger. Their anger is therapeutically part of their liberating themselves. All oppressed people can tell you about this. Denying their anger, telling them to shh, they know that. Because that's what the ruling class and every hierarchical structure has been telling them, and their parents, and forever. So sometimes allowing the oppressed to vent their anger is part of bonding. And if you're not ready to do it, you have to ask yourself, are you ready to bond? Who said it would be easy? Who said there wouldn't be trauma? Who said there wouldn't be arguments? Who said there wouldn't be disagreements? Embracing, we must learn to embrace the oppressed. It's part of the solution to unity. Something else I want to say, maybe if I remember it out, but attitudes are so important. It's so important. When we're big enough, I hope, and this will take a while because organizations and movements have to reach a certain level of strength before they can actually influence culture. But I hope that our party can be central to engendering a culture of solidarity that affect the way people are with each other. And also that replaces the liberal paradigm, which is a fallback that a lot of people have. And there's some good things about it. There's some progressive things about it, But its class origins and its class purpose are suspect. We revolutionaries must create a revolutionary culture that deals with arrogance, that deals with inequality, that uplifts the oppressed, that is a culture of humility. Why? Not to take anything away, but for us to grow as a movement and as a class and as revolutionaries. In the 60s, we thought about this and talked about this, and if we were lucky enough, experienced this, because there were revolutionary struggles. There were Vietnamese people dying. Right. We were over here demonstrating. They were dying. you know, under, you know, these incredible B-52 bombers, you know. There were people living in tunnels, eating a bowl of rice, you know. Talk about humility, talk about discipline, you know. The demand is not that we all of a sudden become like them. That's not possible, and we can't ask ourselves to do that. But if you want to remain a revolutionary, I think, you have to keep practicing. You know, and it's a journey. You know, it's a constant journey. And no one should be too, I don't think anybody should be too critical of anybody. I think people should love each other and embrace each other and be tolerant and give each other some space. And if people make mistakes, they should be allowed to, you know, overcome them and learn. You know, but we have to become more and more revolutionary. And it has to affect more and more of everything we do and say and the way we act. And this is not a bad thing. This is not a terrible thing. This is not a burden. At the end of the day, it's liberating, I think. Maybe I'll finish with that.